do something a little different. I want to spend a little bit of time, and I said I was going to do this earlier in the year, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the food plots I have, and more specifically, get into how I determine where to put my food plots. So from my perspective, now everybody's situation is going to be a little bit different, but I went through it and thought about how I managed that decision on where to put my food plots. In fact, pretty much every food plot I've planted, I've gone through this thought process, and basically you look at it from different perspectives. And so I'm going to talk about the three perspectives I look at it from. I look at it from a perspective of a farmer, because you're wanting to plant something to make it grow. I look at it from a perspective of the hunter. What is my expectations for this food plot, and how am I going to get to it, and stuff like that. And then the perspective of the deer. They definitely are a big part of why you're doing your food plot. So I think it's good to spend a little bit of time trying to figure out what some of their tendencies are on your property and how that relates to your food plot. So you put all those things together and you come up with a decision. So anyway, that's the thought process I go through. So let's dive in a little deeper on each one of those. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is the hunter. And so when you get your property, or you have a piece of property somebody's letting you put a food plot on, and it's wooded, it's a challenge to figure out where to put your food plot. So the first thing I did was, once I determined the plot I was going to buy, I looked at maps. And so the first map I drew up was a Google map, which is pretty good. Google Earth was decent. You get some good ideas of what your topography is like. The best I've gotten so far has been from a hunting app. I use HuntStand. There's a lot of different ones out there. I'm not claiming one over the other. They do similar things. I like HuntStand, so I'm gonna show that a little bit right here, so you can get a view of it. So what I like about it is it gives me a layout of what my land looks like. I drew in the borders of the property, and then the cool thing was that this property had recently been logged, and so I had some, as you expand it out, you can see I had some clearing, although when I moved onto it, it was no longer cleared. It had all overgrown. So it had been, I think it had been wooded like 4 years ago. So everything, all the trails had been overgrown, but I had a topography that showed kind of where the logging trails were. And you could tell the logging trails because the vegetation just looks a little bit different, and it's too much of a pattern. And so I specifically went out on my property with a compass and this topography and tried to figure out all these logging trails, and I marked them, and those became my trails. And so I think that's a great first step. I discovered that my property offered logging trails. It had a lot of hills and valleys, and so I needed to take that into mind in any place that I put a food plot. I knew I didn't have a flat place necessarily just to clear out and put a food plot. So that was a bit of a challenge. The next thing I had to determine is how I was going to access this property. Once I had a good idea what the topography was like, or what my land looked like from a map perspective, the next thing I had to do was determine how was I going to access, or how I was going to manage this land. And the previous food plots I had access, or I had a tractor, and so that brought in a lot of different elements than, let's say, you're going to do this by hand. If you're doing this by hand, it's also very doable. It just, you have to think through everything I need in my food plot and how I'm going to do it from doing it by hand perspective. For this property, I decided that I didn't want to invest in a tractor. Um, I decided I would do everything by UTV or ATV, and so that was a change in perspective for me. Um, so some of the impacts of that. So every main trail I identified, and I did. I went through and said, certain trails are going to be main trails, and it's okay if you bump deer off of them. I'm willing to make that sacrifice. It's the trails that I'm going to run my ATV on or the UTV on, and it's how I'm going to access my property to the different wherever food plots, wherever, putting up tree stands, all this. It's the main um, trail, and that trail I want to extend from where this camp is all the way to the end of the property as far as I can get. And if you followed this, I've gotten pretty close to that end. I have one more bridge to build to get all the way there. But anyways, that's the thought process I went through. So doing it by ATV or UTV means that every trail needs to be about 4 feet wide or a little bit wider. And most of the implements you pull behind an ATV are going to be between 4 and 5 feet wide. And so that impacts what you do. If you have a tractor, some of your tractors, you could have a very large tractor, so that means your trails are going to be much more significant. But it could be that's what your food plot supports best. For me, in this situation, because of the hilliness and stuff, and just because it's remote, I have to travel out here. The investment in a tractor didn't make sense to me, but it may to other people. It's not a judgment. It's just what I chose to do. If I had chosen to do it by hand, which I did give a lot of thought about, was that I would have made my trails man size. So I probably wouldn't have had a trail wider than 3 feet, I don't think. I would have made them tall and about 3 feet wide, so they're comfortable to walk through. And I think the deer would have used them a lot more. Although the deer use the ATV trail a lot, so it's not that they don't. But it would have been a different thought path, and it meant that what I carried in to create my food plot, I had to carry on my back or with me, and things, hauling a chainsaw, when to help make your food plot, and then seeding everything would have had to been more of a throw and go type situation. Although you can definitely do some hand raking in certain areas and stuff to help. But that would have been a process that I would have had a thought, put some thinking to. And then as the hunter, you got to figure out, okay, so I know my access, I know how I'm going to manage my food plots, and then you got to figure out, okay, what am I going to plant? And so that's a long, hard process to go through. At least it was for me. But then it became easier when I saw what I was competing against. So the food plots around me plant corn. So I knew that corn was probably the staple that a lot of these deer around here eat on. And so for me, that meant that a good clover field or a triticale, in the winter, a nice winter oat or even a winter wheat will give the deer nourishment that is not available through a cornfield, and won't necessarily compete with other things that like corn. So that help me narrow down what I would plant on my food plot. And knowing what you're going to plant then relates to also how you're going to manage. On my food plots, I rely. I don't have access to irrigation, so that's a determination too. Some people do, and so that makes a difference as well. So, anyways, once I had determined, what I was going to plant and how it fit in with my environment here, from a hunter perspective, then my decisions are made. And so, next, let's look at the farmer perspective.
probably one of the areas most taken for granted, I would think. There's a lot that goes into making something grow. And if you've ever failed like I have, you know it's not nearly as easy as some would think it is. So, all right, so what are the elements you got to look at as from a farmer? So the first is, so we're standing in it, right? There's a lot of sunlight right now. And this food plot, I'm on the food plot in the middle of the woods, with its second expansion, now gets a lot of sunlight. You need soil, right? You need a place. The neat thing about clearing your land by hand is you get to know your soil, your slope, all those elements. This field has a very much of a, it slopes top to bottom, and at parts it's fairly steep, which is fine. The land around here, it's going to be hard to find any land that's perfectly flat. I have some elements that are flatter than others. Space to do it, you need light, you need water. In Tennessee, we get a lot of water in the spring, a lot of water late fall, and off and on during the winter. But from May through September, water's hit or miss. And so last year, the grasses I planted, most of them died out in August. Not completely gone, but they had, the heat shrunk them down. When the water would come, when the rain would come, they would perk up again, but they weren't, like very hardy because of the lack of rain. And I do not have a way to irrigate, so I'm rain dependent. You got to know what kind of seed you're going to plant and how you're going to do that. And that ties into what we talked about as the hunter perspective. What is your food plot going to offer the deer? And so once you have that figured out, then from a farmer perspective, you know how to till your soil, what do you need to do to broadcast your seed, and so forth. Time for it to grow. So that's obvious, but you have to be patient. You need the right temperature. So there's no point putting your food plot seed out when it's 10 degrees outside. Not a lot's going to happen. So you need to know, oh, hey, Lily, I'll walk over by you. Hey, buddy. So you need to know what temperature zone you're in, that, how that seed matches that, and when's the right time to put it out, to broadcast it. Like, I put clover out, and it wanted the temperatures to be in the 50s, 60s when I did it. So I didn't put this out until, a week ago. And so, because it hadn't been, we were still getting, in fact, we got frost the other night, but it's been getting warm enough during the day. I think it's fine. Well, it must be, because it's growing really well. All right, the last element is, and it's an important one, is, what are the nutrients in your soil? And for me on this property, I did take the time to do a soil sample. Deer Creek Seed Company, the place where I get my seed from, and I'm not paid by these guys. I'm too small of a channel anyways, I think. But they offer a kit. They send you, you can check your soil. You just fill up the bag with samples from around your food plot, and then they send you an analysis. The University of Wisconsin does it. And for mine, it basically said you need everything. But the most important thing that I saw was my pH was okay. So I could grow things because the pH was right. So I didn't need to put anything down to alter my pH. Okay. But I needed to add, I need to add nitrogen, potash, stuff like that. So, okay, and I will, and I have been, to help it. And the soil is slowly turning a little bit more like soil and less like clay. From a farmer perspective, those are the things. Now, there are farmers that watch this channel, and they're going to tell me if I'm full of beans, which is fine, and I'm good with that. I think the best way to learn is to get all the inputs. And so it's always good to have other inputs. But these are the factors I consider. And that's what I put in place for mine. All right, so the last perspective is going to be the deer. Let's go look at that. All right, the last perspective on that you got to factor in on where to put your food plot is the deer's perspective, and you get that by reading. Just read information, and you're a hunter. You've learned tons of information about deer. You know that they come out in the dawn. That's their they have a name for it, and I'll put it in there. But they're the type of animal that thrives in dusk and in dawn. They like the twilight times. They they eat, rest. Their bedding is very important to them. They in the winter their movements are going to be pretty much dictated by the weather. In the summer, the heat affects them. Like most animals, they need water. They need a sustainable food source. And in the summer and the spring, the food is prevalent. It's everywhere. I think when a food plot offers the most benefit is at the time at fall, when their foliage is starting to dwindle and a deer doesn't have as much to eat. And you'll see them, once they start going after acorns, it's also probably a time they're going to start looking at, what else is green that they can eat. And if you have a food plot that has green for them to eat, they're going to end up there. And so what are the elements they need to get there, to see, how are you going to get them to see your food plot, to know your food plot's there? And, there are elements you can look for. So like one, Lily's going right down it. I'm going to turn around. I'm going to turn you around and look, and I think you'll be able to see this. So yes, Lily's going right down at this. But if we get down and look, do you see it? The smashed down leaves and the path that Lily's going down. This whole path is a well-worn path for deer to come. Now they'll sense Lily's small dogs. They probably won't care. Come on, Lily. So it's very active. So knowing your paths, and when you go through and look at your property, sighting where your deer paths are is important. The fact that there's a very strong group of paths around where I made this deer plot was a big factor for me. I knew deer were moving in the area, so that was important. You want to give them a place where they feel safe and secure. If you look, here's the edge of the food line, of the forest line. And see those brush right there? The trail's right next to it. Those brush grow up during the year, and that gives them a lot of cover coming out, and they can actually pretty much walk this edge of the food plot. And if you turn and look from their perspective up, you have hill. It's kind of shady, dark, gives them a nice, easy access in. And then you look up the hill, and look, you got a brush pile right up there that gives protection. We have some half down trees. We have a lot of brush growing. So yeah, do you hunt your food plot or not? Differing opinions on it. My food plot in Virginia, me and my friends hunted it every year. We would shoot quality doe and sometimes quality bucks off of that food plot every year. And the area that I was in had a heavy pressure. Where you sat and looked at the food plot, the deer had no idea that there was would know anybody was there. And so when a deer was shot, often the other deer on the food plot just continued to eat. The other one in the back was much smaller, and so if you shot a deer off of that, then you could pretty much guarantee for the next few weeks you weren't going to see too many deer on it. Here, I have not hunted on the food plots. Now, if I have a guest or somebody over and they've never shot a deer, I'm going to let them hunt the food plot. For deer season, I've left them alone and only hunted the trails. It makes it harder to do that. You have to put more effort into it, but in the end, it's very doable, and I go along with that. Why the difference? I don't have because this property was forested. Now it's 7 years ago. I do not have enough mature trees to put a tree stand in far enough away from the food plot to make it where you could hunt it without the deer knowing they're being hunted. As my property matures, I do think I'll probably end up hunting on the food plot, especially as I get older. My ability to climb trees and hunt trails will lessen, and so I'll be looking for a way to hunt on a food plot that isn't so demanding. And so if you're going to hunt your food plot, just know that has an impact. Try to do it in a scenario where they don't know that it's a human hunting them. And there's nothing wrong with hunting. I don't condemn. I think the purpose of a food plot is to help you get your deer. And if you need to shoot at that deer on that food plot, then do it. The other thing to know for your deer, if you can, is try to figure out where they're bedding. If your doe bed in a certain spot, then try to build your food plot, 20, 30, maybe 60 yards away. You really see that play factor in the wintertime. Here, the deer bed about 20 yards off the food plot in one direction. They bed across the street, which is probably 60 yards from the food plot in another direction, and another group beds down by the creek. Yeah, it's funny. There's deer moving behind me, and that's why Lily's growling. But anyways, yeah, so knowing where they bed is good. We're standing in the shade of this pretty beech tree. I think it's my favorite tree on the property. It's just beautiful under here. All right, so you have the perspective of the hunter, the farmer, and the deer, and you roll all that together, look at your property, and you put all those pieces together, and you find the one that optimizes the most of those things, and then that should be your area. This plot I'm on, I built it off of a logging trail where I knew there was heavy deer activity, and I knew that deer were bedding near. Smaller growth trees on it, and I could cut through it with a chainsaw easier. That was a factor. And the topography of the soil is, although it's a hill, it's not a super steep hill. And so I knew you could put seed on it and it wouldn't all run off in the rain, and you could grow. And I knew that the soil around here, although full of clay, eventually will grow things. So anyways, I put all that together, and this is the first plot. The second one, I spent even more time thinking about, and basically I found that through hunting. I was sitting in a deer stand, and I looked off to my side. I'm going, wow, that's an interesting area. It was full of pine trees, but it had a gradual slope to it. It was an area that bordered probably the heaviest traffic of deer that I have, and so all the larger bucks bed up in the pineland, and so that food plot is up near the pinelands, and so that's on purpose too. So all those factors, went into it. That's how I did it. I roll that all together, and you pick out the things that match best and put your plot there, see what happens. The worst thing that can happen is, you've made a nice place for animals to get food. That's the worst that's going to happen. Like my son said, you went from an area that didn't really have a lot of animals sustaining on it to an area that has a lot of animals now on it. Everything seems to have flourished a little bit because of these food plots. So that's a side benefit too, It's not all just about the deer that benefit from it. Other things do. I now have, I hate raccoons, but I have raccoons now. I have possums. I have things that weren't necessarily very prevalent now hanging out around my food plots. And so I'm happy with that. The bird life is much stronger, although some of it's crows. I don't like crows. I mean, you get the good with the bad. So that all factors into it too. So anyway, I just encourage you to do it. Anything from a throw and go to, bring your tractor out and make a huge plot. Pay somebody to clear a couple acres, and there you go. You can have a wonderful food plot. And so it all depends on what you want to do. All right. I hope hope this is beneficial. I appreciate you watching, hanging out with me. Means a lot. Means a lot to Lola too. So I do appreciate that. Make kindness your business. Do something kind for somebody. And like I always say, Dave out.